In this Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Nightclaw build. This is a build that uses the Claws of Night, which is one of the new DLC weapons. It's a claw weapon. It's probably one of my favorite weapons so far in the DLC, so let's get into this weapon and how it works. So the Nightclaw is a claw weapon that only scales with Dexterity. It's a bit of a strange weapon, really, because it has a little bit of strength requirement, very mild, and some Dexterity requirements. But it does both physical and magic damage that increase with your Dexterity scaling. This is pretty rare for a weapon. There are hardly any, or I can't even think of one off the top of my head, that does both physical and magic damage that doesn't have some other stat that it scales with, either intelligence or arcane. So it's pretty unique to see a weapon with both damage types and only have Dexterity scaling. Additionally, this weapon has native bleed buildup on hit, which is fantastic. It has 110 critical rating like a lot of other claws does. And what's really great about this weapon as well is that it is kind of infused with like a smith script. So when you go to do the heavy attacks of this weapon, it's actually going to chuck the claws like the throwing knife would or the throwing weapon would. So it's kind of a hybrid weapon between a melee weapon and a throwing weapon, depending on whether you're using a light or heavy attack, kind of giving you the best of both worlds. And it also has scatter shot throw, which is absolutely fantastic. Doesn't deal a ton of damage, in my opinion, unless you hit like a big enemy or big boss point blank, but it does a fantastic amount of bleed buildup, and you can use it to trigger bleed reliably when you're in boss fights. And Scattershot Throw is also really good when you're facing multiple enemies. It's a great way for a weapon that doesn't have a lot of reach to deal with multiple enemies because you can kind of fan out and hit them all simultaneously. So some really interesting things about this weapon are that the Smithing Talisman will actually increase the damage of your thrown attacks. So if you're doing heavy attacks, whether you're dual wielding, single wielding, jumping and throwing, running and throwing them, you're going to have that damage boosted by the Smithing Talisman. It doesn't do a ton of damage in my opinion, so using that may or may not be a great idea. But one of the reasons that this weapon is really good in my opinion is that when you're on horseback, if you're using the heavy attack, you can actually throw your claws at enemies, and that's a good case to use this. Because there are a lot of bosses that, even though you might not deal a ton of damage to while you're riding around on horseback, flinging your claws at, you're still going to be at a safe distance, really minimizing the danger of the fight, and this can help boost your damage in those cases. Additionally, the Axe Talisman will boost your charged heavy attack, which in this case throws the weapon. So you can get more damage from using the Smithing Talisman and the Axe Talisman if you're charging up your heavy attack fully, throwing it. And again, I don't really recommend this playstyle simply because you have to be kind of close in order to get full damage out of throwing this like you would out of any other Smith script weapon, and it doesn't deal that much damage anyway. Nonetheless, I thought I would mention it here simply because, you know, people watching this video might want to know these things about this weapon when making their build. Another really cool thing about this weapon is that if you're doing a charged heavy attack and you backstep in the middle of it, you'll kind of do like a feint and step backward and throw your weapon, which is kind of cool. And also if you do a block counter, you'll kind of like spin backward and throw your blades forward. And both of those instances you're throwing your weapon, so you will gain increased damage from the Smithing Talisman. And in the case of block counters, the Curved Sword Talisman will further boost your damage when doing block counters this way as well. Those things being said, I don't really lean into the heavy attacks of this weapon very much, and I don't really use the block counters of this weapon very much. And the real reason for that is because the stance damage of claws is relatively low. It is one of the lower stance damaging weapons. It's very hard to stance break bosses and enemies doing block counters or doing charged heavy attacks. So I tend to stay away from them because we can just build up attack power and get a lot more damage with standard dual wield R1 attacks than we can by playing that way. And that's really what I've done with this build. I've leaned into the rapid attacks of this weapon type, its high attack rating, its native blood loss buildup, and the fact that you can use Scattershot Throw to hit enemies and bosses when they're at range until they get back into melee range. I also have the Mesmer Soldier Shield here in my offhand that I do use sometimes, and that's because it kind of matches the style that I'm going for. It has very low strength requirements at 10. We don't need hardly any strength for the Claws of Night anyway, so only a couple more points in order to use this. It has great guard boost. And there are just some instances where it's easier to block certain attacks and then like switch back to dual wield and attack, or maybe throw out some ranged heavy attacks and like play it safe with a little bit of defense, even using block counters now and then. and then go back to dual wielding. These instances are few and far between, but even still, it's nice to have a shield there sometimes in order to just block when you need to block. So for armor, I'm using 3 pieces of the Black Knight armor set, and I'm using Letta's armor for the chest piece, and that's because this increases your damage when you dash, backstep, or roll. We roll a lot with this build, and popping up and attacking with our R1 combo, that's going to increase our damage. So this is really, really nice to have for this build, and sometimes you will do dashing R1 attacks as well, so it just works really well. Talismans that I use for this build don't change a whole lot. I do have Millicent's Prothesis and Rotten Winged Sword Insignia for rapid attacks. I feel like these two benefit this build a lot. If you don't have both of them, you can use Winged Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prothesis. Millicent's Prothesis also gives you 5 Dexterity, and since this weapon only scales with Dexterity, that's really nice for this build as well. We build up attack power very, very quickly on bosses, and we get tons of use out of these. And there are a few other good talismans for this build as well. I find that the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman is exceptional in boss fights. You tend to drain your stamina bar between your weapon skill, which is very stamina hungry, and your constant R1 flurries. So whenever you're in boss fights, I highly recommend slotting the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman. You don't really need it as much out on the landscape when you're exploring, doing dungeons, etc., because you don't attack just over and over and over and over in a lot of those instances. A lot of those times you attack a couple times, back away, back a couple times, back away, etc. So you don't really need it on the landscape, but great during boss fights. Additionally, Crusade Insignia is really good on the landscape for boosting your attack power after you kill an enemy for a bit of time. And I just find that it's beneficial overall. Another good one as well is Lord of Blood's Exaltation. You do tend to trigger bleeding quite easily, particularly if you use the weapon skill. But when you're in a boss fight, you're not going to be able to use Crusade Insignia, so I tend to swap out Crusade Insignia for Lord of Blood's Exaltation in boss fights in order to get increased attack power when I'm fighting bosses. And usually what I'll do is I'll try and use my weapon skill a few times at the beginning of the fight in order to trigger blood loss and then to get that, extra attack power up before I go into my R1 combos. And a couple other talismans that are actually pretty good for this build. The Lacerating Cross-Tree Talisman increases your damage when you do a dash attack. So if you're running and press R1 or running and press R2, you're going to get increased damage here. We do some of those with this build, so that is not a bad option. And also the Retaliatory Cross-Tree Talisman is fantastic. It does something similar, but instead of boosting dash attacks, it boosts backstep attacks and roll attacks, or attacks after rolling. Again, we do rolling a lot in this build. It's our primary means of defense, and we already have some boost to that from Letta's armor, so that would be a good one. Of the two, I think the one that increases their damage when rolling is better, simply because you roll more frequently in a boss fight than you do dash attack. Attribute-wise, at level 168 for this build, I have 55 Vigor, 30 Mind, 40 Endurance, 10 Strength, 85 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 7 Faith, 9 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence, Faith, or Arcane. That was from my starting class. You would think Intelligence would benefit this build because of the magic damage that it does, but it does not, so you don't need any. Dexterity is at 85 because we're actually getting 5 from Millicent's Prothesis here. Otherwise, this would be 80. And I find that the damage you still get even after 80 Dexterity is decent, which is why I left it at 85, and eventually you'll take this up to 99 to just maximize your damage, because there is literally no other way to get damage from scaling out of this weapon. 10 Strength is there in order to use the shield. If you don't want to use the shield, you only need 8 Strength, which I think every starting class has at least, or pretty close to it. 40 Endurance is to give us plenty of stamina, whether you're blocking or you're just doing your R1 combos or you're using your weapon skill. You use lots of stamina with this build, and it also gives us very high equip load, so if you wanted to use heavier armor with more protection, that would also benefit this build a lot, because we are hyper aggressive with this build. I trade damage all the time. Getting more poise, getting more protection would be good, so if you're really min-maxing, you would load up on more protection here. And again, having 51 poise is very important for this build to be able to poise through attacks. Having more is even better. Maybe having like 56 or something like that would be beneficial depending on the weapon that's attacking you. So using heavier armor would be good. We have 30 Mind here in order to use our weapon skill liberally. You don't really need 30 Mind. I find that 30 Mind is only really useful for certain boss fights. You'll probably get away with 25 or 20 earlier on in this build, but eventually it just makes it so that you don't have to worry about your FP as much in boss fights. And then lastly, I have 55 Vigor here. This is to get tons of health because we do trade damage. Eventually, you'll take this up to 60. You won't go any higher than that. And for Flask of Wonders Physique, I have the Thorny Cracked here. This boosts damage further with successive hits. We have 2 talismans that do this already. This is a third one. This is pretty standard on aggressively fast-hitting builds. This really helps us melt bosses. In the other slot, I have the Winged Crystal tier. This helps me light roll in boss fights. even though I'm wearing like heavier armor, and is just really good for mobility. I find light rolling makes a lot of boss fights a lot easier, so that's kind of what I have here. You could go with the Green Burst Crystal tier for more stamina recovery if you want. That would also not be a bad choice. I stayed away from the Bloodsucking Crack tier for this build, even though I really like it on some aggressive boss killing builds like this one. The reason I stayed away from it is because you have to attack so many times so quickly. You end up trading damage a lot more frequently than you do with a lot of other builds that are aggressive. And when that happens, if your health's bleeding down, you're probably going to get yourself killed. You generally can't kill a boss fast enough that you're never going to get hit. At least most players won't with this type of build. So I generally don't use that in this build. You can obviously put it in instead of Wing Crystal tier if you are confident enough, if you know the build well enough and bosses well enough. But generally, if you're just trying this build out, I don't recommend it. And when it comes to Great Runes for this build, there are a few that work just fine in my opinion. You could use Redans for extra health, stamina, and FP. All those are good for this. You could use Millennias to get health back after you take damage and then you retaliate. We do that a lot in this build, so that would be good. And Morgoth's is also not bad just for extra health. You can trade damage and really not have to worry about your health pool. So that wraps up my Nightclaw build. This was such a fun build to play. Bosses absolutely melted. I was surprised how effective this build was. I have done previous Claw builds, but I haven't done one in the DLC. This one was just absolutely amazing, and I really love that this weapon has a mix of melee and ranged attacks. So you really have something for every situation. If you need to range an enemy down, you can. If you need to get up close and just shred them up, and it just works really well. And because we have that shield as well, it gives you an option to like block or, you know, block counter or even parry if you want to slot something like that on it if you'd like. As always, if you have further tips about the build or further questions, please leave them in the comments and I will try and get to them as soon as I can.